I was driving back to Portland after visiting my sister in Seattle. It was a 4-hour drive I'd made dozens of times, but usually during daylight hours. This time, I left later than planned and found myself on a rural stretch of I-5 as the sun was setting. My 10-year-old Civic had been making a strange noise for the past month, but I'd been putting off taking it to a mechanic. That decision would end up being the worst mistake of my life. The temperature gauge shot into the red zone without warning. White steam began billowing from under the hood, and the engine made a terrible grinding noise before cutting out completely. I managed to coast onto the shoulder before the car died entirely. I tried restarting it several times, but nothing happened. Just a clicking sound and more steam. I checked my phone, no service. I popped the hood and stared at the engine, though I knew next to nothing about cars. Something had clearly blown, and coolant was leaking everywhere. I set up my emergency reflectors and turned on my hazard lights. Traffic was sparse on this stretch of highway. I'd seen maybe 3 cars in the past 20 minutes, all of them speeding by without slowing. The sun had fully set now, and the darkness felt oppressive. I kept checking my phone, walking around holding it up, hoping to catch just one bar of service. After about 40 minutes, I saw headlights slow down in my rearview mirror. A white pickup truck pulled in behind me, and relief washed over me. The driver kept his headlights on, illuminating my disabled vehicle. I saw a man get out and approach. He looked to be in his 40s, average height, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt. Nothing remarkable about him. He asked what happened, and I explained the situation. He offered to take a look and suggested I sit in his truck where it was warm while he checked things out. Looking back, there were warning signs I should have noticed. How he positioned his truck so the headlights would blind anyone passing by. How he kept glancing up and down the highway, checking if other cars were coming. But I was cold and stressed and just grateful someone had stopped. When he said my radiator hose had burst and he couldn't fix it here, I believed him. When he offered to drive me to the next town where there was a motel and mechanic, it seemed like the obvious solution. I grabbed my purse and phone from my car and climbed into his passenger seat. We'd been driving for about 10 minutes when I realized we had passed an exit without stopping. When I mentioned it, he said the next town had a better garage. That's when uneasiness began to creep in. I pulled out my phone again, making a show of checking for service, and noticed we were heading west on a smaller highway, away from I-5. I casually asked how much farther, and his answer was vague. Then I saw him lock the doors with the central locking button. We turned onto a gravel road, and panic surged through me. This was no route to any town. I began thinking of ways to escape, but we were already pulling up to an isolated house with a detached garage. He said we were stopping at his place first to get some tools. The moment he turned off the engine, I lunged for the door handle, but the child locks were engaged. He grabbed my arm with surprising strength and pressed something against my neck. A sharp pain, then blackness. I woke up in a basement, concrete walls, a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, and a bare mattress on the floor. My wrist was handcuffed to a chain bolted into the wall. My shoes, jacket, and purse were gone. The reality of my situation hit me like a physical blow. No one knew where I was. No one would be looking for me here. I wasn't expected back at work for 3 more days. I alternated between panic attacks and desperate planning. I tested the chain's reach and examined every inch of the basement within my radius. 3 days passed. He brought food and water twice daily, but barely spoke. I could hear him moving around upstairs, leaving early in the morning and returning in the evening. I tried to engage him, to humanize myself to him, but he remained detached. I learned his name was Derek, that he worked construction, and that he'd done this before. He had a routine, which gave me both hope and dread. Hope because routines could be exploited. Dread because it suggested he had no plans to let me go. On the 4th day, I heard him preparing to leave as usual, but something was different. He was rushing, swearing about being late. I heard him drop something, curse, and then the front door slammed. The usual sound of his truck starting and pulling away followed. I waited, listening intently. No return of footsteps. He was gone, and something felt off about his departure. I examined my restraints for the 100th time and noticed something I'd missed. The bolt securing the chain to the wall had loosened slightly. For the next hour, I worked at the bolt, twisting and pulling until my fingers bled. Finally, with a shower of concrete dust, it gave way. I was free from the wall, though still handcuffed to the chain. I dragged it with me up the basement stairs, praying the door wasn't locked. It wasn't. He'd been in such a hurry he'd forgotten to lock it. The house was silent and empty. I found a landline phone in the kitchen and called 911, giving them the address I saw on a piece of mail. The police arrived within 20 minutes. They freed me from the handcuffs and took me to the station, where I gave my statement over and over. They caught Derek returning to the house that evening. In his garage, they found my car, already partially dismantled. In his basement, they found evidence of other victims. Some had survived like me, others hadn't. It's been 2 years since my escape. I've moved to a new city, started therapy, and joined a support group. I still can't drive long distances alone. I have a tracking app that my sister and best friend monitor when I travel. I know his full name now, but I refuse to say it. I know he'll spend the rest of his life in prison. But when I'm falling asleep, I still feel that chain around my wrist. I still see headlights slowing down behind me on a dark road, and I wake up screaming. My wife Emma and I were traveling from Phoenix to Santa Fe for her cousin's wedding last summer. We decided to take the scenic route through some lesser-known parts of Arizona to make a mini vacation out of it. Emma had just finished her medical residency, and I'd wrapped up a major project at work. The trip was supposed to be our first real break in years. We'd packed light, just one suitcase between us and a cooler with snacks and drinks for the road. The trouble started about 4 hours into our drive. We'd turned off the main highway onto a state road that cut through a particularly desolate stretch of desert. The temperature display on our dash read 112 degrees Fahrenheit. Our car, an aging Toyota Emma had since college, had been running fine until it suddenly wasn't. The temperature gauge spiked into the red and steam began billowing from under the hood. I pulled over immediately. When I popped the hood, I could see coolant spraying from a burst hose, sizzling as it hit the hot engine block. Emma checked her phone. No service. Mine showed the same. We hadn't seen another vehicle for at least 40 minutes. The paper map we'd brought showed we were about 60 miles from the next town. We took inventory of our supplies, half a bottle of Gatorade, 1 full water bottle, 3 granola bars, and a bag of trail mix. The car's AC was obviously no longer an option, and the inside was quickly becoming an oven. We debated our options, stay with the car or start walking. Everything I'd ever read about desert survival said to stay with your vehicle, so that's what we decided to do. We created a makeshift shade using the car doors and a blanket we had in the trunk. The sun was merciless. We rationed our water, taking only small sips every hour. I kept checking the road in both directions, straining to hear the sound of an approaching engine, but there was nothing except the occasional cry of a hawk and the constant, oppressive silence of the desert. As afternoon turned to evening, we felt a surge of hope. Temperatures would drop, making everything more bearable. Night did bring relief from the heat, but it introduced new problems. The temperature plummeted, and we huddled together in the car for warmth. Sleep came in short, fitful bursts. We woke to a blood-red sunrise that promised another scorching day. Our water situation was becoming critical. Emma, with her medical background, was all too aware of what we were facing. We were already showing early signs of dehydration, headaches, dry mouth, fatigue. We'd gone through most of our supplies, leaving only half a water bottle between us. By midday on the second day, Emma was becoming increasingly worried. "If someone doesn't come by tonight, we need to consider walking out at dawn tomorrow," she said. her voice raspy from dehydration. We'd seen exactly 0 cars pass by. Our phones remained useless slabs of metal and glass. I kept thinking someone would notice we hadn't arrived at our destination, but we weren't expected in Santa Fe for another day, and we'd told people we were taking our time on the drive. That afternoon, Emma suggested we should drink our urine if necessary. It's mostly water, she explained, and while it's not ideal, it's better than nothing. The idea disgusted me, but I knew she was right. We were down to our last few swallows of water. We'd tried collecting morning dew using plastic bags, but it yielded barely a tablespoon. We tore up a t-shirt to make mouth coverings, which helped reduce moisture loss when breathing. I had started urinating in an empty bottle, just in case. On the morning of the 3rd day, Emma wouldn't wake up properly. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her skin hot and dry to the touch. She was mumbling incoherently. I knew these were signs of severe dehydration progressing to heat stroke. I was in bad shape myself, dizzy, confused, with muscle cramps that made me cry out in pain. I made a decision. I would walk for help at dawn the next day if no one came. I couldn't just sit there watching Emma die. That evening, Emma slipped into unconsciousness. I kept checking her pulse, which was rapid and weak. I tried to get her to drink some of my urine, but she couldn't swallow. I was crying, begging her to hang on. I spent hours by the road with our only flashlight, signaling into the darkness. I tried starting small fires with the car's manual and some dried brush, but they produced more smoke than light. At some point, I must have passed out beside her. I woke to the sound of a vehicle. For a moment, I thought I was hallucinating. A pickup truck had stopped next to our car. 2 men in work clothes were peering in at us. I couldn't speak, just waved weakly. They pulled us out, gave us small sips of water. One called for help on a satellite phone, while the other checked Emma. I saw the look they exchanged and knew. Emma's body was already cooling despite the heat. She died sometime during the night, likely from dehydration complicated by heat stroke. The men had only noticed our car because they were looking for a place to stop and check some equipment. If they'd taken a different route or stopped a mile earlier or later, they would never have seen us. I spent a week in the hospital recovering from severe dehydration and heat exposure. Emma's parents flew in. The conversations are a blur, explaining what happened, why we didn't bring more water, why we didn't start walking sooner. Questions I ask myself every day. The wedding was postponed, then eventually happened without us. I find myself obsessively checking weather forecasts now, carrying gallons of water in my new car, and plotting the locations of every gas station before any trip. When people ask what happened to Emma, I usually give a vague answer about an accident. How do you explain that the person you loved most died of thirst while you watched, helpless, just a few feet away? How do you explain that there are places in this country where you can still die of something as simple as a broken car hose? Our cross-country RV trip had been in planning for over a year. My wife Diane and I had saved up vacation time, pulled our kids, 12-year-old Tyler and 9-year-old Mia, out of school for 2 weeks, and mapped a route from our home in Michigan through Wisconsin, Minnesota, South Dakota, Wyoming, and finally to my brother's place in Montana. We'd been on the road for 9 days and were deep in the Wyoming backcountry when our 36-foot Winnebago started making strange grinding noises. The nearest town was over 70 miles away according to our GPS, and cell service had disappeared hours ago. I pulled over on a narrow stretch of Forest Service road where tall pines blocked most of the afternoon sunlight. The RV's engine made a final whining noise before I cut the ignition. Popping the hood revealed nothing obviously wrong to my untrained eye. No smoke, no leaking fluids. We had enough food and water for several days, solar panels for basic electricity, and a decent first aid kit. What we didn't have was a working vehicle or any way to call for help. I spent an hour trying to diagnose the problem using the owner's manual and some basic tools. Diane kept the kids occupied with board games inside. The forest around us was eerily quiet. No traffic, no distant voices, not even many birds, just the occasional rustle of wind through pine needles. As the daylight began to fade, I reluctantly admitted defeat. We'd have to spend the night here and figure out a plan in the morning. Maybe hike to higher ground to find cell service, or flag down a passing vehicle. After dinner, we played cards and tried to keep things light for the kids' sake. Tyler asked if we should be worried about bears, which honestly hadn't occurred to me until that moment. I assured him we were safe inside the RV, though I made a mental note to check that all windows and doors were securely locked before bed. Around 9:30, we heard the distant sound of an engine. We rushed to the windows, hoping to see headlights on the road, but the sound faded without any vehicle appearing. Someone on a different forest road, perhaps. I woke sometime after midnight to the sound of Mia using the bathroom. When she returned to her bunk, I asked if she was okay. "I saw a flashlight outside," she mumbled, already half asleep again. I sat up, suddenly alert. Through the small window above our bed, I could see only darkness. Probably just a dream, I told myself. But I got up anyway, checked the locks, and peered out each window. Nothing but black forest. Still, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The next morning, I was the first one up. I stepped outside to assess our surroundings in daylight and immediately noticed something odd. A set of footprints in the soft earth near our door. They circled the entire RV. I followed them to where they disappeared into the underbrush. A forest ranger checking on us, perhaps. But why not knock? I decided not to mention it to Diane or the kids yet. No need to worry them. After breakfast, I did another inspection of the RV's engine and discovered something that turned my blood cold. Several wires had been cleanly cut. This wasn't a mechanical failure. Someone had deliberately disabled our vehicle. I carefully closed the hood and went back inside, trying to maintain a calm expression. I told Diane I needed to speak with her privately and led her to our bedroom at the back of the RV. When I showed her a photo I'd taken of the cut wires, her face went pale. "We need to look through our photos," Diane said suddenly. When I asked why, she explained that she'd had an uneasy feeling for several days, like we were being watched. We scrolled through our vacation pictures together, studying the backgrounds. What we found made my skin crawl. In a photo from a South Dakota gas station, 3 days earlier, there was a gray pickup truck. The same truck appeared in the background of a picture taken at a Wyoming diner 2 days later. And most disturbing of all, in a selfie Diane had taken at our campsite in the Bighorns just yesterday morning, there was what looked like a telephoto camera lens peeking from between trees in the distant background. We needed a plan. I had a handheld emergency radio that could possibly reach a ranger station. We also had a detailed topographic map showing we were about 7 miles from a small ranger outpost. Diane suggested that she stay with the kids while I hiked out for help, but the thought of leaving them alone made my stomach turn. Before we could decide, Tyler called from the front of the RV. "Dad, someone left something on the windshield." Taped to our windshield were 3 Polaroid photos. The first showed our RV parked at a campground in Minnesota 5 days ago. The second was our family eating lunch at a picnic area in South Dakota. The third was Diane and I standing outside the RV last night after the kids had gone to bed. We'd been followed for hundreds of miles, photographed while we slept, and now our stalker wanted us to know it. I grabbed our hatchet from the emergency kit and ushered everyone back inside. Locking the door, I told Tyler to watch the rear windows while I covered the front. Diane kept Mia occupied, though it was clear from her wide eyes that our daughter sensed something was very wrong. Minutes stretched into an hour with no sign of anyone outside. The silence was almost worse than if someone had appeared. I tried the emergency radio, but picked up only static. We needed to leave. Staying in the RV was like waiting in a trap. We packed essentials into 4 backpacks: water, food, first aid supplies, and the emergency radio. I brought the hatchet and a large hunting knife. Using the map, I plotted a route to the ranger station that stayed on marked trails. As we prepared to leave, I noticed something that made my decision final. Fresh tire tracks in the mud nearby. Someone had been here very recently. Perhaps even while we were inside deciding what to do. The hike was tense. Every snapping twig made us freeze. I kept the kids between Diane and me, constantly scanning our surroundings. We reached the ranger station after 3 hours of careful hiking. The relief I felt at seeing the small cabin with its Forest Service vehicle parked outside was overwhelming. The ranger on duty, a woman named Peterson, radioed for help immediately after seeing the Polaroids. While we waited, she showed us a bulletin board with photos of wanted individuals. There, in the corner, was a grainy shot of a man with our RV model written beneath it. He'd done this before. The police found our RV undisturbed, but discovered a campsite about a quarter-mile away with surveillance equipment and a detailed journal tracking our entire trip. There were maps of our route with notes on our stopping points, descriptions of our daily routines, even information about which sides of the RV we typically exited from. They never found the man, though they identified him as someone connected to at least 3 similar incidents in national parks and forest areas across the western states. I sold the RV as soon as we got home. We've taken exactly 1 family trip since then, staying in hotels with interior corridors and multiple security cameras. Even now, 3 years later, I still check the backgrounds of our family photos. I still look for unfamiliar vehicles that appear too often. I wake up at night thinking I hear footsteps circling our house. The police say he's likely moved on to other targets, other families whose vacation photos and social media posts reveal their routes and routines. But I know what it feels like to be hunted, to realize that what you thought was a random breakdown was actually a trap set by someone who had been watching you all along. And I'll never shake the feeling that someday we'll look up to find a familiar face watching us from a distance, camera in hand.